Hello tankers and tankettes, and welcome to another of my What Tank series. It's been a little while since I did the last one, which was on autoloaders. Today I thought I'd take a look at another tank class that I haven't covered yet, which is of course tank destroyers, as if the Hetzer wasn't a bit of a giveaway. So tank destroyers are one of the main classes in World of Tanks. You've got your actual tanks, and you've got tank destroyers, and then you've got SPGs. So they're one of the three broad categories to be found in the game. What makes tank destroyers different? Well, the most immediate obvious difference for a lot of tank destroyers is they've got a fixed gun position on the front of the tank, basically. Some of them have got a superstructure, and the gun's more towards the back of the tank, but generally speaking, your gun's sticking forward and you don't have a turret, and that presents some challenges, but there are bonuses as well. There are compensations for overcoming that difficulty. Now, what Wargaming have done in game, what they've implemented as tank destroyers as a broad class, it actually encompasses several different kinds of vehicle, and they're kind of typified by ones that are actual tank destroyers. Some, in the case of the Soviet ones especially, that were actually direct fire SPGs, or even just regular SPGs, and some vehicles that could be used as both SPGs, assault guns, whatever, and others that were purely meant as assault guns. Oh, excuse my phone there. Such as the British Nuffield line, the T-28/T-95. Those were all meant for rolling towards enemy fortifications rather than taking out tanks. But Wargaming has just lumped them all into the same category, and generally speaking, there's some variation in there, but tank destroyers more or less have a similar play style. Now, there's two kind of very broad stripe types of tank destroyer. There's the minority are kind of pretty well armored. They're reasonable at rolling towards the enemy in some situations, and you can just play them as an assault gun. Basically, you roll towards the enemy, you put in the fire, and you're maybe not going to lead an assault under most circumstances, but you're not going to be that far behind heavy tanks. You're going to be out in the open, basically. Although, artillery depending, of course. Others they much more rely on stealth. They rely on being sneaky. You have to kind of be using cover such as bushes a lot more. You're shooting from a much further distance because you don't have the armor, and you really are relying on your camouflage value and your ability to use terrain and fall back and run away if need be, to actually stay alive in a battle. That encompasses much more, and there's kind of gradations on that particular side of tank destroyers, because that's most of the tank destroyers in the game. I mean, some like the Hitlog, for instance, is a very mobile machine. You can move around a lot and fall back. Others, slower ones like this, or the Churchill gun carrier, you're tied down to a single spot once you get there, and a lot of them with very poor mobility. I mean, the Tiger 8.8 is another one. You kind of have to be very careful about where you're going on a map, because once you're there, it's very, very hard to relocate. So those are the two kind of main broad classes. I personally don't like the second kind so much, where you have to sit back and snipe. I like the more mobile ones, where you can actually relocate and get in people's faces if need be, although that's sometimes not the best idea. But the French at tier 7 and up are particularly good at that. They've got very good mobility, and once you get to the tier 8, the tier 9, tier 10, you get very good armor to go with that as well. So what kind of bonuses do you get? Because like I've already said, a lot of them have these fixed guns, which, as you can imagine, is not a good thing under some circumstances. Well, It varies. Some have very, very good view ranges, especially at the top tiers. But when you get to the top tiers, a lot of tanks have good view ranges anyway. But even at lower tiers, you get some that have. I mean, the Dickomax is a good example. Has 400-meter view range. The Hellcat has got 370. I mean, some of the low tiers. The FCM 36 has got 400, which is ridiculous at tier 3. They're all about the open top ones, especially, and that have good view ranges because they're open top. They're kind of more multi-purpose because they're able to spot for themselves and do damage at the same time. Whereas you get some of the ones with poorer view ranges. Het's got 260 view range, which is frankly rubbish. You're very much reliant on other people spotting for you if you're sitting back in a bush somewhere. So how much you are able to sit back and snipe and spot stuff for yourself before it gets too close very much depends on view range. But generally speaking, the open top vehicles have got very good view range. The main bonus of playing a tank destroyer is that they tend to have very good guns for their tier. Now, especially when you get to higher tiers, they have some of the best guns of their tier, excluding artillery, which are, you know, massive amounts of damage but not very accurate. Tank destroyers tend to be way more accurate. But even in the mid tiers, when you have the tank destroyers and some other tanks, for instance, the M6 and the Hellcat pretty much share the same gun, but the Hellcat gets superior stats compared to the M6, things like aiming time, accuracy. So even if the damage and alpha stats are the same for other tanks on the same tier, you will generally have superior stats in other regards, which even rate of fire, which is a very important one because that means your effective DPM is higher. So the biggest bonus of a tank destroyer is generally the guns and the ability to do damage. But with some vehicles, that's going to be very much damage in a supporting role. You're not often going to get to do that damage in a role where you're in the thick of it, leading a charge or supporting a push behind other tanks, unless you're playing one of the more armoured ones, maybe. You also get, as a general rule, better camo than other tanks, with possibly the exclusion of light tanks for obvious reasons. There is quite a lot of variation within the tank destroyer line. For instance, the E25 is obviously going to get better camo than the Jagdtiger 8.8 because that thing is huge, especially the bigger machines at higher tiers. Camo value, forget it. But some of the more stealthy machines, the French ones are all fairly low profile. Some of the Russian ones are fairly low profile. They still have the same penalty of if they fire their gun, then they lose their camo. Your maximum camo bonus is when you're sitting still for a number of seconds, and once you fire your gun, obviously that's gone. A downside of some of the designs with very limited gun traverse, I don't know why I'm picking on the AT-15, that's got very good gun traverse. I don't know, let's pick on the Hetzer, for instance. If you've got very limited gun traverse and you're constantly having to turn your tank, then you're not getting the full bonus, the full benefit of that camo bonus when you're stationary for a long period. So some tanks, some tank destroyers, it's a mixed bag. I mean, the Churchill gun carrier especially was bad for that. The ARL V39 is bad for that. The fact that you're not getting the full benefit of increased camo factor on a tank destroyer, just because you're constantly having to turn your tank. So that one more kind of depends on the individual tank, and also, like I've said, you have to bear in mind if it's a big machine, then forget it. The downsides, the main downside is that well, for one thing, you're a big target, especially at higher tiers when you've got a bigger gun. If you get lit up, you're a priority target for a lot of people. If you're in kind of tier 7, 8, 9, 10, people know you've got a big gun, and you get spotted, and people know you've got no armor, then you might find your tank evaporating very quickly. So that's something you have to be careful of. Artillery especially loves to pick on tank destroyers because a lot of them are quite long, flat vehicles. They've got flat roofs, and of course, on a lot of tanks, the roof is not very well armoured at all. So artillery shells will go through for full damage, and it's possible to get one-shotted quite easily. So artillery is definitely a constant worry. Just getting spotted is a bad thing, especially at higher tiers. You also tend to have less hit points than your counterparts in other vehicles. That's not always true. I mean, the Tortoise on tier 9 after the AT-15 gets a ridiculous amount of hit points. I think it gets, what, 2,000? Which is comparable to heavy tanks at tier 9, but that's kind of an exception. In fact, a lot of the British Nuffield line get pretty good hit points for their tiers, but generally speaking, you're going to have less hit points for your tier than heavy tanks and even medium tanks, really. We'll compare that to a tier 5 medium. You know, that's got 600. Let's have a look at another tier 5. That's 610. Ram 2, that's 610. So it's the case that you're having to be careful, because a lot of these don't have good armor and you don't have many hit points as well, so you can't afford to take the hits. You have to be very careful. And some of them, especially the ones, the new German TD line, the Dickermax is another one. They're open tops, they've got thin superstructures, so HE shells are especially dangerous, because HE shells will pen your superstructure and do full damage. So like a KV2 shooting a Dickermax or a Hellcat, for instance, it's not totally a guaranteed one shot. You might get unlucky and hit their gun module or something, but there's a very good chance that you're just going to vaporize them. And it also, open top vehicles, it makes artillery especially dangerous. So that is a massive downside. You have to play these vehicles very carefully, because if you get careless, you're going to die pretty quickly. Now, I've said there's a lot with fixed guns. That's not universally true. There are a couple that have turrets. Now, up until fairly recently, it was really only on the American line. You had the Wolverine and the Jackson, which then go on to the fixed line of the Americans. You also got the M8A1 going all the way up to the T110E4, all of which are turreted. And the Hellcat's probably the most fun of the line, and the T25-2 is generally less well regarded. And then you get to these things, which are all... I mean, the T30 used to be on the heavy line, and it is effectively a heavy tank with a very nice gun. But the T28 prot's another kind of oddity. Sort of good frontal armor, but terrible sides, and again open topped, very slow, so artillery loves it. But there are also now on the German line the Waffenträger series, which from I think tier 8 to tier 10 actually also have a rotating superstructure, which is kind of a turret, and it's, like I've said, it's extremely thin. It's very, very prone to HE fire. Some of them have got I mean, the tier 8 especially has got a very low profile, but those are tanks where you really, really need to stay hidden, otherwise you're dead meat. So that's the kind of benefits and drawbacks of a tank destroyer. It used to be, I'll also make a note to say, it used to be the case that tank destroyers also earned even less XP than other tank types, and there was some rebalancing from Wargaming on that part, so it's better these days. But bear in mind, if you've got a scout tank spotting you, for instance, spotting for you rather, and you're shooting, or you're just shooting something that an enemy, one of your teammates is lighting up, the way the spotting system works means that they effectively get some of your XP for doing that, because that's how scouts make their money, and that's how spotting has been set up by Wargaming. So you might make less under some circumstances than you would have thought you would, but that's because some of your score has been, air quotes, borrowed by another tank on your team with the spotting damage. So that's a thing to bear in mind as well, if you're in one of the ones that can't really spot for itself effectively. So, a brief word on the play styles of the different tanks, and I think there's kind of broadly speaking four categories, which I kind of touched on already. You can play if you're in a slow, unarmored, very poor mobility tank destroyer, of which there are a few in the game, not many, but a few. You're kind of relegated to going to a single point on the map and sitting there and supporting basically. And some maps are just terrible for those tanks. Some are kind of better if there's like a single choke point. For instance, Cliff comes to mind. If you're in a Churchill gun carrier, that's the point where you can sit yourself some way back and just act as a support gun. Some are capable of doing that, but with a lot more mobility. And I tend to think of those as being more the kind of mobile sniper category, and that's things like the E25, the Stug, the French line are good at that because they've got the ability to relocate if they think they're in danger, if they think they're spotted, and it makes it possible to be more active. You can actually advance behind friendly tanks and provide some support from the rear. You still have to make use of cover, you still have to make use of bushes and houses and terrain, but it gives you more flexibility, it gives you more options rather than sticking at a single point and just camping there the whole match because you can't do anything else. I mean, something like the E25 is particularly and spectacularly good at that because it's so fast. It's a little ninja. It's an auto-loading ELC pretty much. It's a kind of a ridiculous machine in some regards. But at the lower tiers, I mean, there's things like Electo, which is that's on the Tetrarch chassis, which you can imagine that's fairly fast. The M8A1, which is on I think a Stuart chassis, so that's fast. The T49, the Hellcat is very good at that as well, just again because it's very mobile. I think the SU100 to a lesser extent, but that's got a nice meaty gun to it. So these are all tanks that are very good for being flexible in a variety of situations. You can also, again, this is a kind of a thing that requires more flexibility, the ability to move around the battlefield, is you can use them for ambush tactics. This is particularly successful if you've got a tank destroyer with high alpha damage, but you kind of need some cover to retreat to, because generally if you've got high alpha damage, you are also in a situation where you have a long reload to deal with, basically. So at higher tiers especially, you're going to need to be able to fire and then pull back into cover. But that kind of ambush tactics, and that's usually, that's going to involve bushes or whatever, and hopefully you're going to have backup. You're not just going to be doing it on your own, because then you'll just get rushed and surrounded and die or whatever. But that can be kind of effective for halting an enemy advance, for instance. Somebody comes round a rock and gets vaporized by your ISU. People behind them are going to hesitate, for instance. And if you're in a scout, there's nothing more annoying than whizzing, you think you've got a clear lane to the enemy artillery and you're whizzing through and suddenly, surprise tank destroyer, blam, vaporized. So ambush it's a lot more situational, but it's very viable in some tanks especially. It's less good for tanks with low alpha but high DPM, because they almost need to keep their distance in order to effectively use the DPM, because if you're having to pull back into cover, these things fire so fast that you're not actually getting the benefit of the gun if you're having to pull back every if you're having to take a shot and then pull back and wait 5 seconds. You're completely ineffective in that case. You need to be able to lay down the fire as fast as possible. I mean, the AT2 with the 6-pounder gun is another example. In fact, all the British tank destroyers really rely on their rate of fire. And at the top end, they kind of more rely on not being spotted as well, even though they've got pretty good armor. And really the last, which is kind of typified by the Nuffield line and also the some of the Americans, like I said, the T-28 and the T-95, as assault, which is What some of these vehicles were actually designed for is assaulting, well, fortifications really. But in the case of something like the AT-15, for instance, you have to do it with caution. But if you're angling properly, this thing is 228 frontal armor. It's in places anyway. It can be absolutely amazing, and it's the kind of thing where if you've got a couple of heavies making a push, it's possible in some situations to basically act as almost a heavy yourself and go with them and provide some firepower. And this is especially powerful if you've got a fast rate of fire, because you can track somebody, for instance, you can pin them down and then your friendlies will finish them off. So that's kind of a trickier one, and it's very, very difficult if there's enemy artillery in the factor, because artillery loves to pick on tank destroyers. And if you're alone, I mean, the massive danger of any tank destroyer is that you get encircled. A lot of these things, especially the more well armored ones, have a very, very poor traverse speed of the hull. I mean, this thing's 20 degrees a second. That's pretty sluggish. The only way you can counter that is if you're up against hard cover and you kind of back up, and I can only describe it as scraping them off to the side, and that then puts them in front of your gun. But even if it's more than one enemy, that's pointless, because you're going to still have people shooting you from multiple places, and that kind of situation, you're dead. So you never want to really lead an assault on your own in a tank destroyer, because you're probably not going to come out very well from that. But that one again is quite situational, and only some machines are good for it. Although some are good for it that you wouldn't necessarily think. I mean, the SU-122-44, because it has such a high DPM, and the hull armor's not too great, but it'll bounce shots occasionally, especially if you're angling. But that just has such a good rate of fire that actually, combined with the mobility, even though the armor isn't what you'd think of being great as for an assault tank, it is actually fairly decent in that role. And the French can be as well, although in the case of tier 7 and 8 you don't really want to so much be in a situation where you're taking fire. But once you get to the Foch at tier 9 and 10, those have really good frontal armor, they've got really good mobility. Those are also very, very good assault machines, where you can just support your friendlies like directly. You can be in the front lines with them pretty much. So yeah, I think I've tried to cover the basics of what tank destroyers are, their drawbacks, and their compensations. And I think I've managed to cover just about all the main play styles that you have to that you'll be facing when you're playing tank destroyers. So yeah, hopefully you've found this all very useful, informative, and it's not just been me blethering on in a boring fashion for I don't know, close on half an hour now. But yeah, I'll throw in this final caveat in that I don't play tank destroyers that much, so I've tried to give a general overview, but I've not gone into specifics too much, because I am not that comfortable in tank destroyers. I know enough to know the basics, basically, but as opposed to giving advanced tactical advice, I'm definitely not up to that. But hopefully you found this useful anyway. So yeah. So if you did, you can leave a comment below. You can hit the like button. You can subscribe to my channel, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.